The stars stretched across the void like tiny diamonds scattered on black cloth. Among them, a ship moved silently through space. It was not like the metal vessels that humans would one day build. This ship was grown, not made. Its walls curved like the inside of a shell, and soft blue light flowed through veins in its surface. Inside the ship, Vexthalan floated in a chamber filled with warm, glowing water. The young Keth Mori had long, thin limbs and skin that changed, color, with emotion. Right now, it showed pale green bands of boredom. Vexthalan had been watching empty space for 3 cycles, looking for new worlds with life. The Keth Mori were old, very old. They had been traveling between stars when most. Worlds were still hot rocks. Their job was simple: find new species and watch them grow. They wrote down everything they saw, how the new creatures lived, how they died, how they built their first cities and discovered fire. It was important work, the elders said. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to keep the stories of all the races that came and went in the galaxy. The Keth Mori were very good at this job. They never got involved. They never helped or hurt the species they watched. They just observed and recorded. Most species followed the same pattern. First, they would discover tools. Then they would fight small wars over food and land. After many years, they would either destroy themselves or learn to live in peace. If they survived long enough, they might even reach the stars. The Keth Mori had seen this story 1,000 times. Vexthalan's skin suddenly flashed bright orange. The ship's instruments had found something. A small blue and green world orbited a yellow star. The planet had water. It had air. Most important of all, it had life. The young observer swam to the control center and began the scanning process. The instruments looked deep into the planet's surface and found many different creatures. Most were simple animals that ran on 4 legs or swam in the oceans, but there was one species that looked promising. They walked on 2 legs. They used tools made of stone and wood. They built simple shelters and made fire. They even had language, though it was basic. The scanner showed that these creatures lived in small groups scattered across the planet's surface. Vexthalan felt excited for the first time in cycles. This could be a real assignment. A chance to document a new species from the very beginning. Most young observers only got to watch species that were already advanced. But these creatures, these humans as they called themselves, were still very primitive. The observer sent a message to the homeworld, describing the discovery. The reply came back quickly. Senior observer Keth Malar himself responded. This was unusual. Keth Malar rarely dealt with junior staff directly. "Young one," the message said, "you have found an interesting world. These humans appear to be at the tool-using stage. Begin standard observation protocols. Document their social structures, their methods of conflict resolution, and their rate of technological advancement. This should be a simple assignment. Most species at this level follow predictable patterns." Vexthalan's skin showed pleased purple stripes. A simple assignment was perfect for building experience. The observer positioned the ship far enough from the planet that the humans could not detect it, even with their simple tools. Then the real work began. The first thing Vexthalan noticed was that humans lived in many different groups. Each group had its own territory, its own language, and its own way of doing things. This was normal for primitive species. What was less normal was how often they fought each other. Most young species fought over resources when food was scarce or when their population grew too large for their territory. But humans seemed to fight for many different reasons. They fought over resources, yes, but they also fought over ideas. They fought over which stories about their gods were correct. They fought over who should lead their groups. The fighting itself was not unusual. Many species went through a violent phase before learning cooperation. But humans approached fighting in a strange way. They did not just use the weapons they had. They constantly tried to make new ones. When one group learned to put sharp metal points on wooden sticks, others quickly copied the idea and tried to make better versions. When someone discovered that certain plants could poison animals, humans found ways to poison their enemies too. They even learned to use animals as weapons, training dogs to fight alongside them and horses to carry them into battle. Vexthalan documented all of this carefully. The observer noted that humans were quite creative, even if they were still primitive. Their tools were simple but effective. Their social structures were complex for such a young species. They had already developed art, music, and storytelling, but there was something else about humans that made Vexthalan feel uneasy, though the young observer could not explain why. Humans did not just adapt to their environment, they changed their environment to suit them. When they found a forest, they cut down trees to build houses. When they found a river, they dug channels to bring water where they wanted it. Other species usually tried to fit into the world around them. Humans seemed determined to make the world fit around them instead. This was not necessarily bad, but it was different. It showed a kind of thinking that the Keth Mori had not seen very often. As cycles passed, Vexthalan watched human civilization slowly advance. They learned to work with metals. They built larger settlements. They developed writing systems to record their knowledge. They even began to map the world around them, sending explorers to distant lands. But the fighting continued. In fact, it seemed to get worse as humans became more advanced. The wars grew larger. The weapons became more deadly. Groups that had never met before found reasons to hate each other. Vexthalan began to wonder if humans would follow the usual pattern at all. Most species either destroyed themselves during their violent phase or learned to control their aggressive instincts. Humans seemed to be doing both at the same time. They built beautiful cities and created amazing art. But they also built weapons designed to destroy those same cities and kill the artists who made that art. The observer sent regular reports to the homeworld. Each report described human progress in technology and social organization. But each report also mentioned the continuing violence. Vexthalan always ended these reports with the same note. Subjects continued to display unusual patterns of behavior. Request guidance on expected timeline for resolution of violent phase. The replies from senior observers were always the same. Continue observation. All species eventually follow established patterns. Be patient. But Vexthalan was beginning to suspect that humans might not follow any established patterns at all. There was something about the way they approached problems that seemed fundamentally different from other species. When most creatures encountered a challenge, they either overcame it with existing abilities or avoided it entirely. Humans did something else. They studied the challenge until they understood it completely. Then they found a way to turn the challenge itself into a tool they could use. They did not just solve problems. They learned from problems and became stronger because of them. This realization made Vexthalan's skin flash worried yellow bands. If humans approached warfare the same way, they approached everything else. Then their violent phase might not end the way it did for other species. Instead of learning to avoid war, they might learn to become very, very good at it. The young observer decided to watch more carefully. Something told Vexthalan that humans were about to do something that no other species had done before. The question was whether that something would be wonderful or terrible, or perhaps, most frighteningly of all, it might be both. Time moved differently for the Keth Mori than it did for humans. What seemed like many generations to the short-lived creatures on the blue planet was just a few cycles to Vexthalan. The observer had watched human civilization grow from scattered tribes into organized kingdoms and empires. The humans had learned to farm the land, which let them build permanent cities. They had discovered how to work with iron, making stronger tools and weapons. They had even learned to sail across the vast oceans, finding new lands and new peoples to trade with, or fight with. Vexthalan had expected the violence to decrease as humans became more civilized. Most species learned that cooperation brought better results than conflict. Trade was more profitable than war. Building was more useful than destroying. But humans seemed to have a different understanding of these concepts. They did learn to trade, but they also used trade as a weapon. If one group controlled something that others needed, they could force those others to do what they wanted. They did learn to build, but they built walls to keep enemies out and fortresses to store weapons in. Everything humans created seemed to have both peaceful and violent uses. The observer had documented many human conflicts over the cycles. Tribes fighting over hunting grounds, cities fighting over trade routes, empires fighting over territory. But these were small conflicts compared to what the scanning instruments were now detecting. Something was changing on the human world. The separate groups were getting larger and more organized. They were forming alliances that covered vast areas of land. More importantly, they were developing new technologies at a speed that made Vexithalan's skin flash concerned orange. Humans had learned to use gunpowder, a discovery that should have taken them much longer to make. They were building cannons and guns that could kill from distances that would have seemed impossible just a few generations before. They were also building ships that could carry these weapons across the oceans to any part of their world. But the most disturbing development was not the weapons themselves. It was how quickly humans adapted their entire societies around new ways of fighting. When one group developed a new type of cannon, others did not just copy it. They studied it, understood how it worked, and then built better versions. Vexthalan had seen other species develop weapons, but they usually treated weapons as tools for specific purposes. Humans seemed to treat weapons as puzzles to be solved. Every improvement led to more improvements. Every solution created new problems that demanded new solutions. The observer was reviewing these developments when the scanning instruments detected something unprecedented. The humans were organizing for a conflict unlike anything in their recorded history. Multiple alliances of nations were forming on opposite sides of a dispute. Millions of humans were being trained for war. Factories were being built specifically to make weapons. Vexthalan sent an urgent message to the home world. Senior Observer Keth Malar, the human subjects are preparing for a conflict of unusual scale. Preliminary scans suggest this war may involve most of their major civilizations. Request guidance on observation protocols for large-scale conflicts. The reply came quickly, but it was not from Keth Malar. Instead, Senior Observer Thekvalos responded. Young Observer, you seem overly concerned about routine warfare. All species go through periods of large conflicts. This is normal development. Continue standard documentation protocols. Do not let yourself become emotionally involved with the subjects. But Vexithalan could not shake the feeling that this was not routine warfare. The humans were approaching this conflict with a level of organization and preparation that seemed beyond what their technology should allow. They were not just gathering armies. They were reorganizing their entire civilizations around the concept of war. When the fighting finally began, Vexthalan understood why the feeling of wrongness had been so strong. This was not like the wars the observer had documented before. This was not even like the wars other species fought. This was something entirely new. The humans were fighting on a scale that covered multiple continents. They were using weapons that could destroy entire cities. They were employing strategies that treated soldiers not as individuals but as resources to be managed and deployed. Most shocking of all, they were adapting their tactics constantly, sometimes changing their entire approach to combat within days. Vexithalan watched in growing horror as humans learned to fight in conditions that should have been impossible. When the enemy used poison gas, humans developed masks and filters. When machine guns made open charges suicidal, humans dug networks of trenches that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. When traditional cavalry became useless, humans put armor on vehicles and created new forms of mobile warfare. But the truly terrifying thing was not how humans adapted to the conditions of war. It was how they adapted the war itself to achieve their goals. They did not just fight with the weapons they had. They invented new weapons during the fighting. They did not just use the tactics they knew. They developed entirely new forms of combat while the battles were still going on. Other species that Vexithalan had observed would fight until one side won or both sides exhausted themselves. Humans seemed to treat the war as a learning experience. Every defeat taught them something new. Every victory showed them a better way to achieve the next victory. The observer began to notice something else that was deeply disturbing. While millions of humans were fighting and dying in the war, millions of others were continuing to live normal lives. They were still creating art and music. They were still advancing science and technology. They were even still having children and building for the future. Most species put all their energy into either war or peace. Humans seemed capable of doing both at the same time. They could fight the most destructive war in their history, while simultaneously planning for what they would do after the war ended. This suggested a level of mental flexibility that no other species had ever demonstrated. Vexthalan's reports became increasingly urgent. The observer tried to explain to the senior staff that humans were not following any known patterns of development. They were not just fighting a war. They were learning to wage war in ways that no other species had ever imagined. The responses from the home world were always the same. Senior observers reminded Vexthalan that all species went through violent phases. They pointed out that humans were still using primitive technology compared to spacefaring civilizations. They suggested that the young observer was overreacting to what was essentially normal developmental behavior. But Vexthalan could see what the senior observers could not. The humans were not just learning to fight better. They were learning to think about conflict in fundamentally different ways. They were approaching war as a science to be studied, an art to be perfected, and a tool to be constantly improved. When the Great War finally ended, Vexthalan expected the humans to follow the normal pattern. They should have been exhausted by the massive conflict. They should have turned away from violence and focused on rebuilding their shattered world. They should have learned that war was too costly to be worthwhile. Instead, the humans did something that made Vexthalan's skin flash the deep purple of genuine fear. They began studying the war they had just finished fighting. They analyzed every battle, every strategy, every weapon, and every mistake. They wrote detailed reports about what had worked and what had failed. They began planning how to fight the next war better than they had fought this one. The observer realized with growing dread that humans did not see war as a necessary evil or a failure of diplomacy. They saw it as a skill to be mastered, and they were very, very good at learning new skills. For the first time since beginning this assignment, Vexthalan began to wonder what would happen when humans eventually discovered that they were not alone in the universe. The young observer tried not to think about what creatures this adaptable and this skilled at warfare might do when they found new worlds to explore and new species to encounter. That night, as Vexthalan floated in the observation chamber, the stars outside seemed less beautiful than they had before. Somewhere among those distant suns were worlds full of peaceful species who had no idea what was developing on the small blue planet. The observer hoped they would never find out. The human world had grown quiet after the Great War ended, but Vexthalan knew it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of preparation. Across the planet, humans were rebuilding their cities, reorganizing their governments, and most disturbing of all, improving their weapons based on what they had learned from 4 years of unprecedented destruction. Vexthalan had documented everything during the conflict, the trenches that stretched across entire continents, the poison gases that turned battlefields into toxic wastelands, the machine guns that could kill hundreds of humans in minutes, the artillery shells that could destroy buildings from distances, measured in kilometers. But what had truly shocked the observer was not the scale of destruction. Other species had fought large wars before. What was shocking was how quickly humans had adapted to each new form of warfare. When trenches made traditional attacks impossible, humans had learned to fight underground, digging tunnels beneath enemy positions. When gas attacks made breathing dangerous, humans had developed filters and masks within weeks, not years. The observer had sent increasingly worried reports to the homeworld throughout the conflict. Each report had detailed new human innovations in the art of killing. Each report had noted the terrifying speed with which humans learned from their mistakes and improved their methods. The responses from senior observers had remained consistently dismissive. War was normal for developing species. Humans would learn that conflict was too costly and would turn to peaceful development. The violence would end as it always did, with exhaustion and a desire for peace. But Vexthalan could see that the senior observers were wrong. Humans had not been exhausted by the war, they had been educated by it. And now they were applying those lessons to prepare for the next conflict. The observers' fears were confirmed when the scanning instruments detected something that made the young Kethmori's skin flash the deepest red of absolute terror. Humans were not just rebuilding from their war. They were rebuilding better, stronger, more efficiently. The factories that had produced weapons during the conflict were now producing machines that could build weapons faster than before. The armies that had fought in the trenches were now training, with new tactics designed to overcome the problems they had encountered. The scientists who had developed poison gas were now working on even more deadly chemicals. Most terrifying of all, humans were sharing this knowledge. The different nations that had fought against each other were now studying each other's innovations. They were learning from their enemies as well as their allies. The war had not just taught each group how to fight better, It had taught the entire species how to wage war more effectively. Vex Thalan sent an emergency message to Senior Observer Kethmalar. Honorable Senior, I must report observations that contradict all established patterns of species development. Human subjects have not entered a peaceful phase following their large-scale conflict. Instead, they appear to be preparing for more advanced warfare. Their rate of technological and tactical advancement is unprecedented in our records. This time, Kethmalar responded personally. The message carried the weight of eons of experience. Young observer, your concerns have been noted. However, you must understand that species often go through multiple conflicts before achieving stability. What you are observing is likely the final violent phase before humans achieve lasting peace. Continue documentation, but avoid emotional attachment to the subjects. But Vexathalan knew that Kethmalar was wrong. The humans were not approaching a final violent phase. They were entering a new stage of development entirely. They were becoming something that the galaxy had never seen before, a species that treated warfare as a science to be constantly improved. The observer's worst fears were realized when the Second Great War began. This conflict made the previous war look like a simple disagreement between children. Humans had learned everything they could from their earlier fighting, and they applied those lessons with terrifying efficiency. The new war began with attacks that covered thousands of kilometers in just hours. Humans had learned to coordinate land, sea, and air forces in ways that allowed them to destroy entire armies before those armies knew they were under attack. They had developed weapons that could level cities from the air and submarines that could sink ships from beneath the waves. But what made Vexathalan's skin turn the pale white of absolute horror was not the scale of the destruction. It was the precision with which humans waged this new war. They had learned to target specific parts of enemy societies, the factories that made weapons, the railways that moved supplies, the leaders who made decisions. Humans had learned that winning a war was not just about killing enemy soldiers. It was about destroying the enemy's ability to fight back. They had turned warfare from a contest of strength into a science of systematic destruction. The observer watched in growing dread as humans demonstrated abilities that should have been impossible for such a young species. They could manufacture weapons faster than those weapons could be destroyed. They could train soldiers faster than those soldiers could be killed. They could adapt their strategies faster than their enemies could respond to them. When one side developed new armor for their vehicles, the other side developed better weapons to penetrate that armor. When one group learned to attack at night, the other group developed ways to see in the darkness. Every innovation was met with a counter-innovation. Every solution created new problems that demanded even more creative solutions. Vexthalan realized that humans were not just fighting a war. They were using the war to test new ideas about combat. Every battle was an experiment. Every campaign was a research project. The entire conflict was a massive learning exercise that was teaching humans things about warfare that no other species had ever discovered. The most disturbing part was that humans seemed to be enjoying the challenge, not the death and destruction, but the intellectual puzzle of overcoming their enemies. They treated warfare like a complex game where the rules were constantly changing, and the only way to win was to become better at changing the rules than your opponent. Halfway through the conflict, Vexthalan made a discovery that would haunt the young observer for the rest of their very long life. While scanning human communications, the observer found records of human scientists working on something called atomic research. The humans were trying to harness the same forces that powered stars. At first, Vexthalan thought this was just theoretical science. Many species discovered atomic theory long before they could actually use it. But as the observer studied the human research more carefully, it became clear that they were not just studying atomic forces. They were trying to weaponize them. The thought of humans with star-powered weapons made Vexathalan's skin flash colors that had no names in the Kethmori language. Other species had eventually developed atomic technology, but it usually took them thousands of years to progress from theory to application. Humans had gone from discovering the atom to building atomic weapons in less than 50 years. When the atomic weapons were finally used, Vexathalan watched 2 human cities disappear, in flashes of light brighter than the sun. The observer had seen many terrible weapons during the war, But nothing had prepared the young Kethemori for the sight of humans unleashing the power of stars against their own kind. But what happened next was even more terrifying than the weapons themselves. The war ended immediately. Not because humans were horrified by what they had done, but because they understood that they had developed something that changed all the rules of warfare. They stopped fighting not out of revulsion, but out of calculation. Humans had learned that they now possessed weapons that could destroy their entire world. But instead of giving up warfare entirely, they began studying how to fight wars without destroying everything. They started developing new strategies, new weapons, and new forms of conflict that could be used in a world where the ultimate weapon was too powerful to actually use. Vexthalen's final report on the Second Great War was very different from the earlier ones. This report did not just describe what humans had done. It predicted what they would do next. The observer had finally understood the true nature of the species on the blue planet. Humans did not fight wars to win territory or resources or even to defend themselves. They fought wars to learn how to fight better wars. Every conflict taught them something new about strategy, technology, logistics, psychology, and organization. They were using warfare as a tool for rapid evolutionary development. The report ended with a single terrifying conclusion. Humans do not wage war. They practice war, and they are getting very good at it. This time, the response from the homeworld was different. Senior Observer Kethmalar's message was brief but urgent. Report to homeworld immediately for debriefing. Do not discuss observations with other junior staff. As Vexthalen's ship prepared to leave the system, the observer took one last look at the blue planet. Down there, humans were already beginning to plan for the next war, even though they hoped it would never come. They were developing new weapons, new strategies, and new ways of thinking about conflict. And someday, those humans might look up at the stars and wonder what else was out there waiting to be discovered. Vexthalen hoped that day would never come. The journey back to the Kethmori homeworld took many cycles, but Vexthalen barely noticed the passage of time. The young observer spent the entire trip reviewing the data collected during decades of watching humanity. Every report, every scan, every recorded observation was examined again and again, looking for patterns that might explain what made humans so different from every other species in the galaxy. The home world of the Kethmori was ancient beyond human comprehension. Vast crystal cities grew from the ocean floors of a planet that had been carefully tended for millions of years. Libraries containing the history of thousands of species stretched beneath the waves, their bioluminescent chambers preserving knowledge that most civilizations could never imagine. Vexthalen arrived at the Central Observatory, a massive structure that floated above the planet's largest ocean. Inside, Senior Observer Kethmalar waited in a chamber filled with flowing displays of light that showed data from across the galaxy. The elder's skin showed deep blue patterns of concern mixed with curiosity. Young Observer, Kethmalar began, your reports about the human species have caused considerable discussion among the senior staff. Some believe you have been too close to your subjects and have lost the objectivity necessary for proper observation. Others suggest that humans may indeed represent something unprecedented. Vexthalen's skin flashed respectful green, but the patterns were mixed with determined orange. Honored Senior, I understand the concerns about objectivity, but I have documented everything carefully. The evidence speaks for itself. Kethmalar gestured to the data displays surrounding them. Show me. Explain why you believe humans are different from the 847 other species we have observed during their technological development phase. Vexthalen activated the recordings, and the chamber filled with images of human warfare spanning thousands of years. Most species follow a predictable pattern, the young observer began. They develop tools, fight small conflicts over resources, gradually learn cooperation, and eventually either destroy themselves or achieve peace. The displays showed charts comparing human development to other species. Humans started the same way, but look at this data. While other species take an average of 12,000 years to progress from bronze tools to basic metallurgy, humans did it in 3,000 years. Most species take 20,000 years to develop gunpowder. Humans took 8,000 years. Kethmalar's patterns showed interest but also skepticism. Accelerated development is unusual but not unknown. Some species advance quickly due to environmental pressures or genetic advantages. That's what I thought initially, Vexthalan continued, bringing up new data. But the acceleration isn't consistent across all areas of development. Humans advanced quickly in areas related to conflict and competition, but at normal rates in areas like art, philosophy, and basic science. The displays showed detailed timelines of human advancement. Art and literature had developed steadily over millennia. Mathematical and scientific discoveries had followed normal patterns for most of human history, but anything related to warfare, logistics, organization, or competition had advanced at unprecedented speed. Look at this pattern, Vexthalan highlighted. Specific data points. Every major human conflict resulted in rapid advancement in multiple technological and organizational areas. The first large-scale war led to improvements in metallurgy, transportation, communication, and mass production. The Second Great War accelerated development in electronics, chemistry, aviation, and nuclear physics. Kethmalar studied the data carefully. You're suggesting that humans use warfare as a catalyst for general technological advancement? More than that, Vexthalan replied, bringing up comparative analyses. Other species treat warfare as a necessary evil. They develop weapons to win specific conflicts, then often abandon those technologies when peace returns. Humans treat warfare as a learning opportunity. They study every aspect of their conflicts and apply those lessons to all areas of their civilization. The young observers showed recordings of human military academies, research institutions, and strategic planning organizations. They have created entire educational systems dedicated to understanding conflict. They study not just how to win wars, but how warfare affects society, economics, psychology, and technology. They have turned the study of conflict into a science. Kethmalar's skin began showing patterns of deep concern. This is unusual, but surely they must eventually outgrow this phase. All species learn that cooperation is more beneficial than conflict. That's what I expected too, Vexthalan said, activating recordings from the period after the Second Great War. But humans learned something different. They learned that the threat of conflict can be as powerful as conflict itself. The displays showed the strange new form of warfare that humans had developed after creating atomic weapons. They called it a Cold War, and it involved two major powers threatening each other with destruction while never actually fighting directly. They have learned to compete through the preparation for war rather than through war itself, Vexthalan explained. They build weapons they hope never to use. They develop strategies for conflicts they hope will never happen. They have turned the possibility of warfare into a tool for rapid advancement. The senior observer's patterns showed colors that Vexthalan had never seen before. You're saying that humans have learned to gain the benefits of conflict without the costs of actual destruction? Exactly. And the pace of advancement has actually increased. Look at their technological development since the end of their last Great War. The displays showed an explosion of human innovation: computers, satellites, space travel, global communication networks. They are advancing faster now than they did during their actual wars. Kethmalar floated silently for a long moment, studying the data. When the senior observer finally spoke, the voice carried the weight of vast experience and growing fear. Vexthalan, I need you to consider the implications of what you are suggesting. If humans have indeed learned to use the threat of conflict as a tool for advancement, and if they maintain this approach as they develop space travel capabilities, the young observer's skin flashed the pale yellow of terrible realization. They would treat contact with other species as a potential conflict situation. They would immediately begin studying any new species they encountered as potential enemies. Worse than that, Kethmalar continued, the Elder's patterns showing deep purple bands of dread. Based on your observations, humans would learn from contact with other species. They would adapt their warfare techniques to deal with new technologies, new forms of organization, new ways of thinking. Vexthalan activated projections showing human space development programs. They have already begun reaching beyond their world. Their first steps into space were motivated by competition between their nations. They turned space exploration into another form of conflict. The two observers studied the images of human rockets, satellites, and space stations. These early efforts were primitive by galactic standards, But they showed the same pattern that had driven human development for millennia: intense competition leading to rapid innovation. "Senior Observer," Vexthalan said quietly, "there is something else. The humans have begun listening for signals from other worlds. They are actively searching for evidence of other intelligent species." Kethmalar's skin went completely white. "They are looking for us." "Not us specifically, but yes. They want to know if they are alone in the universe. And based on their historical patterns, if they discover that other species exist, they will immediately begin preparing for contact," Kethmalar finished. "And for humans, preparation for contact means preparation for conflict." The senior observer activated communication systems connecting to the highest levels of Kethmori government. "Vexthalan, your observations require immediate attention from the Council of Elders. This species represents a type of civilization we have never encountered before." "What type is that?" the young observer asked. Kethmalar's patterns showed the deep crimson of existential fear. "A species that has weaponized learning itself. Every challenge makes them stronger. Every threat teaches them something new. Every conflict, whether real or potential, accelerates their development." The senior observer paused, studying the data one more time. "Most species develop space travel as a natural extension of their scientific curiosity. Humans are developing space travel as an extension of their competitive instincts. They are not just reaching for the stars. They are preparing to compete with whatever they might find there." Vexthalan understood the implications now. Humans would not be content to simply explore space or establish peaceful contact with other species. They would approach every new discovery as a potential challenge to be overcome, a puzzle to be solved, a competition to be won. "What do we do?" the young observer asked. Kethmalar's reply would haunt Vexthalan for the rest of their long life. "We make sure they never find us, and we make sure no one else finds them first." The Council of Elders met in the deepest chambers of the home world, where bioluminescent archives held the accumulated wisdom of millions of years. Never before in Kethmori history had such an emergency session been called. Representatives from every observation station across the galaxy attended through quantum communication links, their images flickering like ghosts in the chamber's flowing water. Elder Sekthulur, oldest of the council, floated at the center of the gathering. Their ancient skin showed patterns so complex that younger Kethmori could barely interpret them. "We have reviewed Observer Vexthalan's reports," the elder announced. "The implications are unprecedented in our recorded history." The chamber filled with worried murmurs as other elders examined the data. Charts and graphs flowed through the water around them, showing human development patterns that defied every known model of species advancement. "In our observations of 847 species," Elder Sekthulur continued, "we have seen civilizations that destroy themselves through warfare. We have seen species that transcend violence through wisdom. We have never seen a species that treats conflict as an educational tool." Elder Morkethan, specialist in comparative civilization studies, activated displays showing human warfare evolution. "The progression is clear. Each conflict teaches them something new, not just about fighting, but about organization, technology, logistics, and psychology. They are not just developing weapons. They are developing better ways to develop weapons." Vexthalan floated near the edge of the gathering, skin showing nervous patterns. The young observer had never imagined that their reports would reach the highest levels of Kethmori society. Senior Observer Kethmalar gestured for Vexthalan to present the most disturbing findings. "Honored elders," Vexthalan began, "the humans have now developed space travel capabilities. Their early efforts are primitive, but they show the same competitive characteristics that have driven their terrestrial development." The displays showed human space programs, with different nations competing to achieve orbital flight, lunar landing, and satellite deployment. They have turned space exploration into another form of warfare. They use the same organizational methods, the same technological approaches, and the same competitive intensity that they apply to military conflicts. Elder Thekvalos, who had initially dismissed Vexthalan's concerns, now showed patterns of deep worry. If they maintain this approach as they advance, they will treat any contact with other species as a potential conflict situation. Worse, added Elder Morkethan, they will learn from that contact. Based on their patterns, meeting other species will accelerate their development even further. Elder Secthuler's ancient patterns showed the deepest concern. We must consider what would happen if humans encountered a typical spacefaring civilization. Most species we observe develop space travel through cooperation and curiosity. They are not prepared for contact with a species that approaches everything as potential competition. The chamber fell silent as the implications became clear. Humans would not just be dangerous to themselves, they would be dangerous to every other species they encountered. Their approach to learning and adaptation would give them advantages that peaceful species could not match. There is another consideration, Elder Secthuler continued. Our own role in this situation. For millions of years, we have observed without interference. We have watched species rise and fall, recording their achievements and failures for the Galactic Archive, but we have never encountered a species that posed a threat to other civilizations before achieving spaceflight. Elder Morkethan activated records from other observation missions. Our doctrine of non-interference assumes that species either destroy themselves or learn wisdom before reaching other worlds. Humans appear to be learning a different kind of wisdom, the wisdom of systematic adaptation and improvement through challenge. Vexthalan spoke again, showing recordings of human research into radio signals from space. They are actively searching for signs of other intelligent life. They have built listening stations and are broadcasting signals into space. They want to make contact. And when they do, Elder Thekvalos added grimly, they will immediately begin studying whatever they find. They will analyze the technology, the communication methods, the social structures. They will learn everything they can about any species they encounter. Elder Secthular's patterns showed the weight of an impossible decision. We face a choice that goes against everything we have believed for our entire existence. Do we maintain our sacred doctrine of non-interference and allow humans to develop naturally? Or do we take action to protect other species from a threat they cannot comprehend? The debate that followed lasted for many cycles. Some elders argued for immediate intervention, either destroying human civilization or somehow limiting their development. Others insisted that non-interference was the foundation of Kethmori identity and could not be abandoned. But slowly, a third option emerged. Elder Secthuler proposed a solution that would preserve the letter of non-interference, while protecting the galaxy from the human threat. We will not interfere with human development, the ancient elder announced, but we will ensure that humans remain isolated until we can determine what they will become. We will create a barrier of ignorance around their solar system. The plan was unprecedented but elegant. The Kethmori would use their advanced technology to monitor all space around the human solar system. Any species that approached would be quietly diverted or warned away. Humans would be allowed to develop naturally, but they would develop alone. We will establish permanent observation stations around the human system, Elder Morkethan explained. Multiple teams of observers will monitor human development continuously. We will document everything they do, every advancement they make, every new capability they develop. Vexthalan was chosen to lead the new observation mission. The young observer who had first warned about the human threat would now spend their life watching that threat evolve. But why permanent observation? Asked one of the younger elders. Why not simply establish a quarantine and check on them periodically? Elder Secthuler's response sent chills through the chamber. Because humans change too quickly. Their rate of advancement is accelerating. If we check on them every few cycles, we might find that they have developed capabilities we never expected. The final decision was unanimous. Humanity would be quarantined, but not contained. They would be watched, but not stopped. And most importantly, they would be studied as intensively as they studied everything else. As the council session ended, Vexthalan found themselves alone with Elder Secthuler. The ancient being's patterns showed a mixture of sadness and determination. Young observer, the elder said, you have discovered something that challenges our most fundamental beliefs about the nature of intelligent life. We have always assumed that species either learn wisdom or destroy themselves. Humans may be teaching us that there is a third path. What path is that, Elder? The path of eternal growth through eternal challenge. Humans may never achieve the peaceful wisdom that we value so highly, but they may achieve something else, the ability to adapt to any situation, overcome any obstacle, and learn from any experience. Vexthalen's patterns showed confusion. Is that not a form of wisdom? Elder Sectalar's response would echo in the young observer's mind for the rest of their very long life. Perhaps. But it is a wisdom that makes them dangerous to everyone else. And the most terrifying part is that they may not even realize it. Years later, as Vexthalen floated in the permanent observation station orbiting beyond Pluto, the observer watched. Human space probes reaching toward the outer planets. Each mission was more sophisticated than the last. Each achievement led to plans for greater achievements. Down on the blue planet, humans continued their strange form of development. They built weapons they hoped never to use. They prepared for conflicts they hoped would never come. They studied warfare as intensively as they studied medicine or art or mathematics. And slowly, inevitably, they continued reaching toward the stars. Vexthalen's skin showed patterns of sleepless vigilance as the observer prepared another report for the home world. Somewhere in the galaxy, peaceful species continued their quiet development, unaware that a race of warrior scholars was learning to leave their world. The title of Vexthalen's report captured the essence of the situation. Human development status unchanged. They continue to treat every challenge as a learning opportunity. They continue to advance through systematic adaptation. They continue to prepare for conflicts that may never come. Recommendation: continue permanent observation. They saw humanity's first wars and learned to make war into learning. We have seen their learning, and we must never sleep again. In the depths of space, alien eyes watched a small blue world, knowing that its inhabitants were destined to change the galaxy forever. The only question was whether that change would come through conquest or through contact, through destruction or through discovery. Either way, the Watchers would be ready. They had learned something from observing humans. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply pay attention, and they would never stop paying attention again.